In both splendor and abundance, one flower on this planet outshines the rest. Each spring, the Dutch lowlands are set aflame by myriads of brightly colored blossoms. This might be the best known plant in the world, but who knows its secret history? The beauty of this flower has intrigued, beguiled, and bewitched rich and poor alike. Once, its bulbs were worth their weight in gold. 3 centuries ago, its luxurious patterns and hues crazed an entire nation. Its bulbs became the object of fantastic financial speculation. Astronomical bets were placed on their rising price. But when the market crashed, thousands of investors tumbled into ruin. It was the first big bust in the history of booms. The burst of the Tulip Bubble. The Netherlands in February 1637. The news spread like wildfire. For the first time, a tulip auction had fallen short of expectations. Over months, prices had soared to fantastic levels. But suddenly, tulips were no longer bought. Overnight, treasured contracts turned into trash. Dreams of super profits had not lasted long. The value of a coveted commodity had proven volatile. The tulip fever had infested a large part of the Netherlands' population. Everyone wanted to profit from the rising demand for these colorful flowers. But now, the party was over. Those with little capital were hit the hardest. People from all walks of life had been infected by the craze. Laborers, craftsmen, and gamblers. People like Adrian the miller.
It was crazy, a true mania, a true speculative bubble, because it made no sense that anybody would bet on an ever-increasing price of a flower.
Economist Peter M. Garber is a market analyst for a major international bank. There are obvious parallels between the 17th century tulip fever and developments in today's financial markets. In both situations, people were and are betting unrealistically on rising prices. Why do people stumble into the very same trap over centuries? British historian Mike Dash has been wondering about this question.
There is something in the human mind, in the human spirit, which makes us not want to believe the truth about stock market bubbles.
Most people participate in a bubble in spite of better knowledge. This was made apparent for the first time by the 17th century tulip mania. During the first half of the 17th century, the Netherlands had an exceptional position in Europe. While the rest of the continent was devastated by the 30 Years' War, the Netherlands enjoyed their golden age. It was the era of Dutch painting, of great masters like Rembrandt, Frans Hals, Rubens, and Vermeer. Thanks to the overseas trade, the national economy was booming. The Netherlands were not ruled by a costly royalty. Their autonomous cities and provinces were governed by councils of citizens and gentry.
The key to understanding the Netherlands early in the 17th century is that it was a very special sort of country. It was the first country in Europe to develop a modern economy, and it was also the wealthiest country in Europe, and it based that wealth on trade. It was the first country which was able to establish direct trading links in a major way with the Far East. And this is where most of the luxury goods came from in this period. And by taking all of those little slices of profit and keeping them to themselves, Dutch merchants became extraordinarily wealthy.
Although capital remained concentrated in the hands of a few, the general public also enjoyed a higher standard of living than in the rest of Europe. This was the case for craftsmen as well as for the domestics, like Anna.
The problem that the Dutch merchants had in this period was that they had gone through the Reformation in the previous century, and Holland was, in fact, in the grip of a rather extreme form of Calvinism. This frowned greatly on any sort of ostentatious displays of wealth. The only thing that these Dutch merchants were really allowed socially to do with their wealth was to display it in the form of things that glorified God. And this really explains a large part of the Dutch obsession with gardens.
A coveted decorative element of Dutch gardens was the tulip, an exotic plant native to Central Asia. In the cold steppes and mountain regions of Kazakhstan, the wild ancestors of Dutch tulip breeds are still found today. They are somewhat smaller than our garden varieties and display many beautiful hues, from red to orange and gold. From Central Asia, tulips were first taken to Turkey, where they enjoyed special appreciation as harbingers of spring. In the second half of the 16th century, the first tulips arrived in Europe to adorn the palace grounds of Emperor Rudolf II in Vienna and Prague. From there, botanist Charles de Lecluse brought tulips to the Netherlands. At the University of Leiden, Lecluse founded a garden named Hortus Academicus, where the first tulip variety he bred can still be admired today. Very soon, this exquisite plant would cast a spell on the entire nation, including Adrian the miller. Adrian was engaged in the game of trick-track when he noticed some hustle and bustle in the tavern's back room. These people seem to be trading something of great value. Lots of flower bulbs and lots of money were changing hands. And anyone was welcome to join in. Adrian saw his lucky chance.
If you grew up in Haarlem and you're a miller, and you try to predict on the basis of what you know about that market and the fundamentals that drive it, try to predict what the future price will bring. You may be wrong. Any speculative investment is driven by the desire to make high returns, and the tulip mania was no different from that.
The only unusual aspect was where and how the deals were made.
What you actually had was a sort of imitation of the real-life economy, which emerges amongst artisans and peasants who don't really know exactly how this is done. They would form their own little stock exchanges or trading groups, which normally met in pubs. So a large part of the tulip trade also took part in a sort of haze of intoxication, which made people more willing to take risks on things that are actually less trustworthy.
First, each bulb was weighed. The seller wrote the price he wanted on a slate, which he handed to the chairman. Then the would-be buyers wrote down their offers. The chairman fixed a price somewhere between the seller's expectation and the highest offer. Adrian made his move. For a tiny brown bulb, he spent his last guilder.
There is maybe some leader that invests in a project, but everyone else in the herd just follows on the basis of that person's doing the investment, and they just throw their money into the project without understanding perhaps what is going on.
Adrian had no experience with tulips. He had never possessed any. All he knew was the demand for tulips was going up. The deals in Haarlem's shady backrooms heralded the growth of a huge industry. Today, 80% of all the tulips sold worldwide are produced in the Netherlands. Each spring, brightly colored flower fields spread from horizon to horizon. But most of these blossoms will never leave the Netherlands. These are just crop fields, and the harvest is bulbs. Once the blossoms have withered, the bulbs are unearthed like potatoes, cleaned and sorted. At this time, mother and daughter bulbs are separated. This form of asexual propagation provides new bulbs for breeding. Back in the 1700s, Dutch gardeners also unearthed the bulbs after flowering. This was to prevent voles and other pests from eating the juicy bulbs of these luxury plants. But another reason, even back then, was to get the daughter bulbs in order to raise identical flowers of each breed. Handling these tiny daughter bulbs correctly requires green fingers. Something had dropped in front of Anna's feet, and no one had noticed. Now, she held her own little bulb in her hands. Surely a flower of exquisite beauty would grow from it next spring. But no one was to know. Anna carefully wrapped her unspectacular gem and hid it in her room. Her treasure was to be kept safe and secret. Adrian, for his part, also appreciated tulip bulbs, but for a different motive. Over the summer, tulip prices had been steadily climbing. The more people joined the speculation game, the faster prices rose. Adrian threw his little bulb on the market. In just a short while, he made a handsome profit. But a good profit depended on which variety of tulip you bought and sold.
Now, when we look today at tulips, we might think that they were beautiful, but they are not the tulips that the Dutchmen of the 17th century saw. They were even more vivid and colourful, and the value of a tulip was extremely closely tied up to the colours on it. And the finer those colours were, the more highly esteemed the bulb was.
To this day, there are tulips with extravagant colour combinations and extraordinary patterns. And still, many of the threats to these delicate plants remain. The greatest threat to tulip bulbs is not the appetite of our little neighbours. The most insidious enemy is hidden deep inside the very cells of the plant. A virus. Today, these germs are well researched. But in the 17th century, they brought surprises to tulip breeders, because a virus can radically alter the appearance of a plant.
A virus cannot live by itself, it needs another organism. Viruses can only multiply within the cells of a host.
Margit Leimer de Camara Mercado is a plant virus expert.
Die Viren sind darauf spezialisiert, die Pflanzenzelle umzuprogrammieren.
The viruses are specialists in reprogramming plant cells, causing havoc in a plant's normal development by reinforcing some genes and deactivating others. When the pigment production in some cells is superactivated, the result can be dark red stripes. When the pigment production is stifled, a bright white stripe will appear, or dots, creating special patterns. Plant viruses are being spread in various ways. This particular tulip break-in virus is being spread by aphids. An aphid sucking at an infected plant can then infect a healthy one. It's easy to imagine how quickly an entire field can be infected when so many plants are so close together. Eventually, the virus is lethal for the plant.
Until this day, this virus poses a massive problem for tulip breeders. You can only fight it manually. The breeders patrol their fields so they can immediately remove suspicious plants and stop the spread of the disease. But then again, it was precisely this viral infection that produced the most extravagant 17th century tulips. Flamed flowers with stripes and curly edges.
To produce a beautiful flower, you have to have the bulb to do it. And the more unique the bulb is, the more you tend to value it. Now, why would a particularly unique and new variety of bulb have a high value, a very high value, so high that it might equal the price of a substantial house, as it did in the Netherlands? Well, that's because that bulb reproduces.
The expectation of increasing a plant's value by 100 or 200% fired the imagination of investors. Back then, little was known about the biology behind the tulip's reproduction, but catalogues listing tulip breeds existed. Due to the nature of its bulb, the tulip is an ideal trade commodity. Bulbs can survive without soil for many months. They are also easy to transport, store, and handle.
A tulip bulb is a storage organ which enables the plant to survive periods of drought or a long and very cold winter.
A certain period at low temperatures is even needed to trigger new growth. As soon as the spring weather offers the right combination of light, warmth, and moisture, the bulb begins to sprout. Within a short time, a large plant will grow from a comparatively little bulb. During the second half of 1637, tulips with a rare flaming pattern fetched 100 guilders per bulb, the equivalent of 4 fat pigs or 1,000 pounds of cheese. To encourage extravagant patterns, bizarre methods were applied. Some even tried to manipulate flower colors by storing bulbs in red wine. Although today's methods make more sense, the results are still far from certain. In spite of elaborate computer modeling, breeders cannot always predict what will happen when they crossbreed various tulips. The solution is to try several crossbreeds and then select the prettiest and toughest ones. And that requires patience. It takes years until a new breed will blossom for the first time. Sometimes an entire decade passes after the first pollination until breeders can really judge the qualities of a new breed. Thanks to their uncomplicated bulbs, tulips are an ideal trade commodity. But bulbs have one major disadvantage. The appearance of a bulb tells you nothing about the looks of its flower. So the purchase of tulip bulbs has always been a matter of trust. And trust has often been abused.
The tulip trade did have to involve a certain amount of trust. It's very hard for us to know, the records are rather scant, exactly how much people believed in what they were being told.
Each bulb carries its own secret until next spring, and that turns any business deal into a gamble. Some breeders try to limit the risk of evil surprises by careful sorting and cataloguing. If by coincidence well-sorted stocks were mixed up, the result could be a nightmare. Even with perfect organization, a certain risk remains. The most valuable specimens would be the ones infected by the virus. But traders had no way of recognizing infected bulbs.
The fact that the flowers are infected means it's very hard to predict what's going to happen the next time the bulb flowers. It may or may not produce one of these broken tulips, which are fantastically valuable. Sometimes a Dutchman would buy an ordinary tulip and it would become infected, and next year it would flower into something incredibly valuable. So a huge element of chance is also introduced into the trade, which for a certain sort of trader makes it even more attractive.
To gain the buyer's confidence, traders used the masterly skills of Dutch painters in a new way.
One of the extraordinary things that then developed in the Netherlands in the 1630s was the development of what is known as tulip books. And these were books produced often on commission by very wealthy tulip traders who would pay artists to actually illustrate the types of tulip they had in their inventory.
These tulip books are our best source of information about historic flowers, or at least of an artist's flowering imagination.
These pictures are very beautiful. They show tulips of the most exotic fineness, but you're still trusting that the person who's showing you this picture does actually own the bulb, and there's still lots of scope there for all sorts of chicanery and mistrust.
These gorgeous images were further enhanced with glorious names, such as Admiral van der Eyck or Ruth van Leyden.
I think it would be fair to suggest that the Tulip books were in effect a form of early advertising, and there was a very definite commercial element to this. The books were undoubtedly used as an advertising medium, sort of as a trade catalogue, effectively, to try to persuade people.
Many traders had never seen a live tulip in full bloom. Adrian too was impressed by masterful illustrations. Three centuries later, the tulip trade has changed. No other market on the globe can boast a greater turnover of tulips than Aalsmeer Flower Market. Trading takes place in a hall the size of several football fields. Each year, billions of plants pass through this hall. The shipping area is a perfectly synchronized logistics machine. Cut flowers are an extremely perishable commodity. Tulips only flower for a few weeks in spring. To extend the harvesting period, cut flowers are bred in greenhouses. Here, they are brought to flower in successive periods under controlled conditions. To accelerate sales, flower exchanges like the one in Aalsmeer operate in the so-called Dutch auction mode. This means counting downward from an announced maximum price. A good deal depends on the right moment of placing a bid. If you bid too early, the price may be too high. If you wait too long, another trader may snatch away the commodity. Money and merchandise change hands immediately, which is known as a spot market. This is the key difference from what went on in 1636. And this is to do with the tulip's growth cycle. Bulbs must be planted in autumn so they can flower in spring. Special attention was paid to the arrangement of varieties and colors. That depended on careful sorting at the time of harvest and on well-organized storage. For Anna's secret bulb, too, the time had come to be planted. A tulip can also flower in a pot, if conditions emulate those outdoors. The key is a cold period during winter. No problem in Anna's unheated chamber.
The nature of the tulip bulbs is that they flower in the spring, and the flowers last for a week or two, and then the bulbs can be dug up and traded as physical items for a few months. For the winter, they must go back into the ground, otherwise they will die. So any trading of bulbs in the autumn or in the winter, by its very nature, was a forward market. They would be delivered when they came out of the ground in June.
In other words, the traders' warehouses were empty in winter. To also make good use of that period, they invented a new method of trading.
When you're dealing with people who are attempting to make money by trading bulbs, only being able to make money for a few weeks of the year isn't a very adequate answer. And the natural extension of this was to trade the possession of the bulb. The way in which the Dutch adapted this is quite fascinating, because essentially what they did was to invent what we would now consider to be the futures trade.
Prices of the physical bulbs did not move that much. It was the forward markets that moved a lot, and that they diverged dramatically from the value of the spot price.
It was the beginning of a new era. Now it was possible to sell goods you did not yet have. You did not buy actual bulbs. You bought the right to purchase bulbs for a set price at a future time.
To give somebody something else, to say you own this bulb which is in this garden, in this town, owned by such and such a person, and if you take him this piece of paper, he will hand over your property to you.
In the back rooms of their pubs, with nothing more than pen and paper, the Dutch had invented virtual trading. To make the absence of goods easier to bear, fantastic paintings provided a visual impression of the goods, while the real plant was still slumbering in the soil of some field.
Up until October, these were strictly futures or forward prices. That is, the buyer of that contract took the downside risk as well as the upside gain.
Many of these old trading contracts still exist. These historical documents tell a story of how quickly the trade with paper contracts became separated from the physical commodities, the actual bulbs.
The bulbs are effectively coins for them, and the pieces of paper are effectively banknotes for them. They are not interested at all in growing the plants, and in fact, growing the plants is a danger to them, because the way in which the trade worked was that the notes which you used to claim the ownership of the flower, they have to be settled when the plant is drawn out of the ground. At that point, you have to have a large amount of money. It's far better to buy and sell and have the money in from somebody else, and so the trade becomes increasingly accelerated and frantic.
Bidders knew well that they were gambling on fantasy figures, but the temptation of raking in profits proved irresistible.
It's called the wind handle, which means the blowing in the breeze, essentially, and that conveys a certain amount of the uncertainty. Just the fact there's nothing really there but wind, effectively, that suggests that some Dutch people were aware of what an uncertain trade the futures trade would actually be.
In principle, it's the same today. Once prices begin to rise, everyone starts buying. This works best when there is little connection between the piece of paper one buys and any real commodity, or when that connection is not understood. The general speculation craze was also fueled by the fact that access to the market was cheap compared to the prospect of high profits.
The people involved are usually very poor. They would mortgage their trade goods, the looms that they had, and use that money to put down payments on tulips. And the way in which they would do it when the bulbs were in the ground would be to buy a promissory note from the person who owned it. a weaver who had just mortgaged his loom for 25 guilders would buy 25 guilders worth of tulips, not 2.5 guilders worth of tulips, and save the balance of 90%, knowing he would have to pay that in the future. The prices were rising so high, that seemed to be completely unnecessary. What would happen is you'd invest everything you could in as many bulbs as you could and hope to actually transfer your responsibility to settle the 90% to somebody else before the bulb was lifted. And in that way, you could make more money.
That becomes a problem at the very moment when no buyer is willing to pay an even higher price. At that moment, panic selling sets in and prices plummet.
There is the objective definition of a bubble, a situation where the prices of an asset rise very rapidly and then collapse.
Something similar happened with the US real estate bubble in 2007. But between December 1636 and January 1637, tulip prices were still on the rise. In some cases, soaring to astronomical heights. The chronicles document the swelling bubble. The prices of some varieties increased by 1,000 or even 2,000% within just a few weeks. This drove a new sort of demand among thieves. The rich now had to protect their fields with alarm systems. At night, thieves would dig up the most valuable bulbs and throw them on the market. Or they stole the very plants they had just sold on paper. The most expensive variety was called Semper Augustus. Even before the tulip fever, its bulbs had fetched 3,000 guilders. Now, the price breached the ceiling of 10,000, the equivalent of a grand hall in Amsterdam's classiest district. But no one had actually seen the flower.
Semper Augustus is a very interesting case. It is the most famous flower of the tulip mania, and yet it was apparently never actually traded. We certainly can't say that any particular person saw the flower. We don't know the name of the person who supposedly owned it. We just know from a chronicle that eventually one of these flowers was supposedly eventually sold.
As with other varieties, all that the traders were able to show was an artist's impression of the ever-joyful tulip. Adrian, too, paid good money for a colourful promise on paper.
You can turn to a tulip book and see a picture of a Semper Augustus. It is highly, highly unlikely that the person who drew this picture had ever seen this flower. Frankly, if you look at this flower and you look at another superbly fine red tulip of that period, you can't tell the difference.
But who cared? The deal was about profit, not a tulip.
It is possible that Semper Augustus was effectively an urban myth.
On the other hand, even if Semper Augustus did exist, it can only have been the result of a viral infection, the mere product of coincidence. Theoretically, even the bulb awaiting spring in Anna's chilly chamber might grow into a preciously flamed tulip. Perhaps, unknown to her, she was the owner of a great treasure in a flower pot.
If you want to have growth, then you start putting your investable resources, your real resources, into somewhat riskier, speculative technologies. If you do that, then often you may lose. You may make a bad investment, and that will, at the end, look like a bubble. Or you may win.
The danger of being caught in possession of some of these promissory notes and not having the capital to meet your 90% commitment became quite a significant concern for people. This caused a sort of flaring up in the amount of trades. We know from some of the records of the period that bulbs could be bought and sold as many as 10 times in a day in one of these tavern colleges, as they were called. And people were obviously trying to shift the liabilities onto somebody else. And this accounts for much of the frenzy of the tulip mania.
Some investors, including Adrian, now took the speculation game a step further. If a crash occurred, how could they profit from that? Perhaps Adrian could make up for his imminent loss later on by buying even more bulbs cheaply after the crash and selling them when prices would rise once more. But most buyers clung to the hope that prices would just continue to rise and eventually balance the debt they had incurred when buying with money they did not have. They knew that they could not afford to exit now, even if they wanted to. As long as all the others would not exit, everything would be fine.
I thought that the tulip speculation in the taverns was just a drinking game that reflected demoralization of the society and was not serious. It was done between people who had very little wealth and they were making very large bets with each other with no prospect of collecting on the bets.
Modern brokers still face the same key question as the 17th century tulip traders. Precisely when do you exit? It's an extremely fine line between maximum profits and catastrophic losses. The watershed is the moment when prices peak and just before the market nosedives into a selling frenzy, a moment that's extremely hard to anticipate.
The speculation, when it reached its peak in fall and winter of 1636-1637, was purely a betting market and not an actual real investment market.
The burst of the bubble took investors by surprise.
In early February 1637, an auction for tulip bulbs took place in a tavern. And for the first time, nobody bid on one of the lots. The auctioneer tried to lower the price and auctioned them again, and for a second time, nobody bid on the flower. This is unprecedented, but the implications were very clear to the people in that tavern. They realised that something very bad was happening, that demand for tulips had suddenly been cut off.
In a moment, thousands of dreams were shattered. People were stunned and horrified, tumbling between sudden realization, denial, and disbelief. The moment of truth had hit like a bolt of lightning.
They rushed out of the tavern to tell their friends, sell, and the panic spread throughout Haarlem. So within a day in Haarlem, the value of tulips dropped pretty much to nothing.
Panic turns into a stampede, as we have seen with every speculation bubble since. Accelerated by modern means of communication, a bursting bubble can turn into a maelstrom which sucks in personal fortunes, banks, industries, currencies, and national economies, tearing at the social fabric of our civilization. In contemporary publications, the tulip traders were lampooned, harshly criticized, even likened to monkeys. These images express the frustration and anger of the masses who felt cheated. Since then, it seems, nothing has changed.
The tulip mania was effectively the first financial bubble that has ever existed. And to be fair to the Dutch people of the early 17th century, they had no particular reason to know that the bubble could not continue to expand forever. This had never happened before. The idea that the bubble would inevitably implode was unknown to them.
After the burst of the tulip bubble, Dutch authorities saw a need for trade regulations. As has often happened since, a debt cancellation was decreed. After small investors had been fleeced, leaving them feeling desperate and frustrated, the authorities may have feared a revolution. Just 10% of the liabilities, the actual down payment, had to be paid when the contracts became due. and some contracts were even declared null and void.
The reason there was no economic distress was that there was no misallocation of real investment resources.
Today, financial speculation is deeply rooted in general society. The bang of a bursting bubble will reverberate across the globe and shake society as a whole.
We still see examples of exactly these sorts of bubbles building up and existing in our society today. And yet still, people continue to make exactly the same mistakes.
Adrian's dream is down the drain. For him, it's back to milling grain. On Anna's windowsill, an extravagantly flamed tulip greets the sun. A few weeks earlier, Semper Augustus would have made her a rich lady. Now she and her flower are what they've always been. Natural beauties, symbols of spring.